My name is James. I'm 38 years old. For most of my life, I've been the quiet one in the room, the son who listens more than he speaks, the brother who doesn't argue, the man who doesn't raise his voice, even when he probably should. People often mistake that for weakness. I work in property compliance and archival research. Nothing flashy. The kind of job people nod at, politely, before changing the subject. I deal in documents, records, forgotten filings, and the quiet details most people overlook. I've built a life around patience and precision, around understanding that what's written down matters far more than what's loudly declared. But in my own family, none of that seemed to matter. After my father died, my parents, well, my surviving parent, and extended family acting in agreement, locked me out of our ancestral home, the house my grandfather built, the house I grew up in, the house where my father taught me how to sand wood floors and repair loose hinges, instead of paying someone else to do it. They changed the locks. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply told me it was simpler this way, that I should move on. Those decisions had been made. I didn't argue. Not then. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about screaming matches on the front lawn or dramatic confrontations in courtrooms. There are no villains here twirling mustaches. Just people who convinced themselves I wouldn't push back, and they were wrong. What happened next unfolded slowly, quietly, methodically. While everyone assumed I was grieving, withdrawing, accepting my place, I was reading, reviewing, retrieving. There is something powerful about understanding paperwork better than the people who underestimate you. I arrived one morning at that same front door, the one they had locked me out of, with the original title deed in a protective sleeve and a court order authorizing enforcement of rightful ownership. They changed the locks. I changed ownership back. But the real story isn't about the legal reversal. It's about identity, about what happens when the reliable, invisible son decides he is done playing a role assigned to him. It's about silence, not as surrender, but as strategy. And maybe, if you've ever been the underestimated one in your own family, you'll understand this more than you expect. Have you ever been quietly written out of something that was always supposed to be yours? In my family, I was the steady one, not the brilliant one. That was my older cousin Daniel, not the charismatic one. That was my aunt's youngest, not the fragile one who needed protection, nor the rebellious one who needed managing. I was the one who handled things. If a pipe burst, I fixed it. If paperwork needed filing, I read it. If my father needed someone to drive him to appointments in his final year, I rearranged my schedule without announcing it. I didn't complain. I didn't negotiate for praise. I simply did what needed to be done. Over time, that became my identity. James will sort it. James won't make a fuss. James understands. The ancestral house in Bath wasn't just a property. It was the center of our family gravity. A Georgian townhouse with uneven wooden floors and a staircase that creaked in 3 specific places. My grandfather had purchased it in the late 1950s, back when the street was still considered unfashionable. My father was raised there. So was I. But even in that house, I occupied the margins. Family gatherings happened around me. Decisions seemed to materialize without me. I was informed, not consulted, trusted with tasks, but rarely with authority. It wasn't malicious. That's the difficult part. No one ever looked at me and said, "You don't matter." Instead, they said things like, "You're so practical, James. You'll be fine anywhere." You don't get attached to bricks and mortar the way your father does. You're independent. Independent. That word followed me like a polite dismissal. When my father's health began to decline, I was the one who learned the boiler system in detail because he worried about it failing in winter. I cataloged old maintenance receipts because he said, these things matter later. I helped him sort through boxes in the attic, documents dating back decades. I listened more than I spoke. My relatives visited occasionally. They brought wine, sympathy, suggestions. But when it came to the daily quiet erosion of illness, I was there. And because I was there, they assumed I would always be there, not as an owner, not as a decision maker, as support. After my father passed, the house felt cavernous. The silence was heavier than I expected. I spent the first week handling practicalities, death certificates, utility notifications, and insurance correspondence. It was mechanical, clean. Then came the meeting. My mother, measured, composed, sat at the dining table. Two relatives joined. Words like streamlining, efficiency, and future planning were used. The house, they explained gently, would be better managed if transferred into a consolidated family trust structure. It would simplify matters. You've always been good with change, my mother said softly. They spoke as though I had already agreed. I remember noticing the way sunlight hit the dining table, how dust particles hovered midair, how my name wasn't on the draft proposal laid before us. Not once did anyone ask what I wanted, and I didn't argue. That, I think, confirmed everything they believed about me. I left that meeting with a polite nod and a folder of summary notes. I was still the steady one, still composed, still reasonable. But for the first time in my life, I felt something unfamiliar, not anger, clarity. They did not see me as a stakeholder. They saw me as infrastructure, and infrastructure, in their minds, could be rerouted. The first real cut wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no declaration that I was no longer welcome. It was quieter than that. 2 weeks after the streamlining conversation, I arrived at the house on a Tuesday afternoon. I still had my key then. I let myself in, as I had done for decades, expecting the familiar scent of old wood and radiator heat. Instead, the hallway felt rearranged, not physically, atmospherically. My mother was in the sitting room with Daniel. Papers were spread across the coffee table. I recognized the blue-backed forms immediately. Land registry transfer, documentation, drafts. They hadn't told me they were proceeding. Daniel looked up first. He gave me a smile that felt practiced. Oh, we thought you were at work. I finished early, I said. There was a slight pause, the kind that's invisible unless you're trained to notice it. My mother gathered the papers, not hurriedly, but deliberately, as if tidying up something fragile. We didn't want to burden you with all this, she said gently. You've done so much already. Burden. I stepped closer, not confrontationally, just close enough to see the top sheet before it disappeared into a folder. My name wasn't listed anywhere, not as a beneficiary, not as co-trustee, not even as an administrative contact. Daniel leaned back in the armchair, as he belonged there. It's just cleaner this way, he said. Consolidated ownership avoids complications later. Complications. I remember nodding. I even agreed with them on a technical point about capital gains exposure. That's the thing about understanding paperwork. You can't pretend to see what it means. And what it meant was simple. They were restructuring the house without me. Not because I was incapable, because I was compliant. That evening, I went up to the attic alone. The attic had always been my father's archive space. Boxes labeled in his handwriting, old insurance binders, yellowing correspondence, title abstracts. I sat cross-legged on the wooden boards and let the quiet settle. Was I overreacting? Perhaps they were right. Perhaps consolidation did simplify things. Perhaps my independence made them assume I didn't care about holding formal ownership. I tried to rationalize it. They're grieving too. They're trying to be efficient. You don't need recognition to know your place. But there was a small, precise discomfort I couldn't ignore. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about property. It was about being edited out of a document that defined my family's future. While sitting in the same house I had maintained through illness, through winters, through decay. That night, I reviewed the digital copy of my father's original will, the version I had helped him scan years earlier for safekeeping. I read it once, then again. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't call a solicitor. I didn't confront anyone. I simply made a note. The first small cut isn't the one that draws blood. It's the one that reveals how steady your hand is when you finally look down, and mine didn't shake. Disrespect rarely arrives as an event. It becomes a pattern. After that afternoon in the sitting room, something subtle shifted. Not in volume, but in frequency. Emails about family property strategy began circulating without me being copied in. I found out about a valuation appointment because the surveyor knocked while I was there, replacing a faulty hinge on the back gate. Daniel apologized lightly, said it must have slipped his mind. It didn't feel like forgetfulness. It felt procedural. At Sunday lunch the following week, my aunt casually referenced when the trust finalizes. She spoke as though it were weather, inevitable, neutral, already in motion. I buttered my bread and listened. No one asked my view, and because I didn't interrupt, the assumption hardened. James is fine with this. I began to notice the language more than the actions. You've always been so adaptable. You don't really need the house, do you? You're not sentimental like Dad was. Each sentence sounded almost complimentary, detached from hostility, wrapped in practicality. I could have corrected them. I could have said, actually, I am sentimental. Actually, I was there every day while you visited once a month. Actually, I understand the land registry implications better than any of you. But I didn't. I told myself I was being mature. That grief distorted judgment. That confronting them would only fracture something already fragile. And if I'm honest, part of me feared confirming their quiet suspicion that I was suddenly being difficult. For 38 years, I had been the reliable one, the one who absorbed tension, the one who translated emotional chaos into organized paperwork and fixed door frames. To challenge them would mean stepping outside that identity, and identities are comfortable even when they diminish you. The house itself became symbolic in ways I hadn't anticipated. I noticed how often Daniel referred to it as the asset, not the house, not home, the asset. I noticed how my mother deferred to him in financial conversations, though she'd once deferred to my father. Authority had shifted smoothly, almost ceremonially. I was still invited over, still greeted warmly, still handed small tasks. James, could you check the fuse box? James, do you still have the boiler manual? James, you're good with these things. Useful, invisible. One evening, I overheard something not meant for me. I'd stepped into the hallway to take a phone call and returned quietly. Daniel's voice carried from the kitchen. He won't push back, he said. It's not in him. There was no malice in it, just certainty, and that certainty settled in my chest like cold air. I didn't confront him. I didn't even let the floorboard creak to announce my presence. I waited a few seconds before re-entering the room, giving them time to finish, because something in me was recalibrating. The repetition of dismissal does something unusual. It stops feeling sharp. It becomes ambient. You start adjusting your posture around it. shrinking slightly to avoid friction, convincing yourself that peace is worth more than recognition. But normalization has a limit, and I was approaching mine, not explosively, quietly. The next time I went up to the attic, I didn't sit cross-legged in reflection. I brought a notebook, not because I planned a confrontation, because I was done pretending I didn't see what was happening. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being positioned. Every family has unspoken roles: the peacemaker, the achiever, the fragile one, the instigator. Ours was no different. But roles only persist because everyone agrees, silently, to keep performing them. Mine had always been the dependable executor, not the visionary, not the inheritor, the stabilizer, the one who ensures continuity but never claims authorship. I began noticing how conversations subtly funneled me back into that lane. When legal language came up, eyes turned to Daniel for decision making, but to me for explanation. When maintenance costs were discussed, I was asked to estimate, but not to approve. When my father's study was reorganized, I was invited to help carry boxes, not to decide what stayed. It wasn't hostile, it was efficient. They had assigned me a function: reliable, useful, invisible. One afternoon, my mother asked if I could just pop by to meet a locksmith. She said it casually, as though asking me to collect milk. "The front lock is sticking," she explained. "It's probably time." I remember standing very still. The front lock, the symbolic heart of a house, is not the kitchen or the sitting room. It's the threshold. Who enters? Who holds access? "I'll be there at 3, I said. The locksmith was polite, efficient. He removed the old brass cylinder and replaced it with a modern, secure mechanism. I watched the process carefully. He handed my mother 3 new keys in a small envelope. She slipped them into her handbag. She didn't offer me one. It was subtle enough that an outsider wouldn't have noticed. I told myself perhaps she'd forgotten. Perhaps she intended to give it to me by pleasure. She didn't. That evening, when I left, I stood on the pavement for a moment longer than necessary. The new lock caught the late sunlight differently, brighter, unfamiliar. I realized something then, not emotionally, but structurally. They no longer saw me as someone who required independent access. I was being downgraded from insider to assistant. The role assignment had matured, and I had allowed it, because challenging it would require stepping into a new identity, one they had not rehearsed me for. I went home that night and laid out 3 items on my dining table: my father's scanned will, the summary of the proposed trust, a small worn key to a metal document box in my own flat. The box wasn't dramatic. It didn't contain treasure or secrets. It contained originals, documents my father had once told me to keep safe just in case. At the time, I thought he meant in case of fire or loss. Now, I began to wonder if he meant something else. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What if my assigned role was never meant to be permanent? And more importantly, what if I were the only one who didn't know that? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Wednesday morning, alone, at my own dining table. There's something about early light in late autumn. It doesn't flood a room. It reveals it gradually. Dust motes, hairline scratches on wood, the faint indentation where a glass once sat too long. I unlocked the small metal document box and placed it in front of me. Inside were the originals my father had asked me to safeguard years earlier. At the time, he'd said it casually, almost absent-mindedly. "Keep these, James. You're the careful one." I hadn't questioned it. Now, I unfolded the first document with slow precision. The original title deed, not a photocopy, not a registry printout. The physical conveyance from when my grandfather purchased the house in the late 1950s. Thick paper, official seals, handwritten annotations in the margins. Most people assume property ownership lives solely in digital databases now. But history doesn't disappear just because it's digitized. It layers. I reviewed the chain of title carefully. Transfer to my grandfather. Subsequent formal update, reflecting survivorship. Then my father's name, properly recorded. Then the will. I read the clause again, and this time I didn't skim. The house was not left to a discretionary trust. It was not left solely to my mother. It was left jointly, with clear survivorship language, to my mother and me as co-owners, not as beneficiaries under a separate structure. I sat back. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt alignment. The proposed consolidated trust structure they were preparing would require my consent or a legal mechanism to override it. They hadn't asked for my signature, which meant one of two things. They believed I would sign without review, or they assumed I wouldn't notice procedural irregularities. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge something uncomfortable. This wasn't simplification, it was erasure through assumption. I poured myself coffee and let the realization settle without dramatizing it. No anger, no racing pulse, just clarity. My father had trusted me with originals for a reason, not because I was passive, but because I was precise. There's a difference. That afternoon, I didn't call anyone. I didn't send emails. Instead, I did what I've always done when something matters. I researched. I reviewed the land registry entries for the property. I ordered official copies. I cross-checked dates. I examined whether any unilateral filings had been submitted posthumously. None had. The streamlining was still in preparation, which meant the door hadn't closed yet. I realized something else that day, something about silence. Until now, my quietness had been reactive. It absorbed. It avoided escalation. But silence can also be proactive. It can be positioning. They believed I wouldn't push back. They were right about the way I used to operate. But something had shifted, not in my volume, in my threshold. I wasn't interested in confrontation. I was interested in accuracy. And accuracy, when applied patiently, has a way of restoring balance without spectacle. By the time evening fell, I had created a folder on my laptop titled simply Whitmore Original Title Chain. No dramatic naming, no hidden password theatrics, just structure. That was the day I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and started asking a different question. If I remain silent now, what exactly am I allowing? Before that Wednesday, my silence had been instinctive. After it, my silence became deliberate. There's a distinct difference between not speaking because you feel smaller and not speaking because you're observing. I had crossed that line quietly, without ceremony. The following Sunday, I attended lunch as usual. Daniel was animated. He spoke about forward planning, about possibly refinancing against the property once it was consolidated into the trust. My mother nodded thoughtfully. My aunt chimed in with cautious optimism. No one asked for my signature. Not yet. Instead, they spoke in assumptions. When this is finalized, once ownership is tidied up, after we streamline everything, I noticed how often the language suggested inevitability, as though paperwork were gravity, unstoppable. I listened. I even contributed in small ways, clarifying tax exposure, explaining timelines at the land registry, outlining how long probate entries typically remain pending before amendment. Daniel smiled at me. See? This is why we need you involved, he said lightly. You're good with the details. Involved. I understood something in that moment. They didn't see me as an equal decision maker. They saw me as a consultant, a technician hired by family loyalty. And because I didn't correct them, their confidence expanded. That week, a draft trust summary arrived via email. This time, I was copied in. The cover message read, "James, just a formality. We'll need your signature here once you've had a quick look." A quick look. I opened the attachment carefully. I read every clause. I examined the transfer language. I noticed the phrasing that would effectively convert my co-ownership interest into a beneficial interest under trustee discretion. It was elegant, legally defensible, and entirely dependent on my consent. I closed the document without responding, not because I was unsure, because timing matters. Silence, when used strategically, unsettles more than an objection. Over the next 2 weeks, I asked neutral questions. Have the official copies been updated yet? Have you factored in stamp duty implications? If there's a formal transfer, has a solicitor reviewed the survivorship clause in full? Each question was mild, professional, impossible to label as combative. I watched the subtle shifts. Daniel became slightly defensive when discussing procedural details. My mother began asking whether everything was really necessary. They started consulting their solicitor more frequently. They still believed I would sign. That assumption was their anchor. Meanwhile, I gathered information. I requested certified copies of the original conveyance from storage. I confirmed that the will's language was unambiguous. I consulted, quietly, with an independent solicitor in Bath, not the one advising my family. I didn't frame it as a conflict. I framed it as verification. The solicitor asked me one direct question. "Do you intend to contest anything?" I paused. "No," I said calmly. "I intend to uphold what already exists." There is strength in that distinction. By the time the reminder email arrived, "Just checking in, James," I had already decided something fundamental. My silence was no longer an accommodation. It was leverage. They mistook it for hesitation. They mistook it for compliance. They mistook it for the same James who avoided discomfort to preserve harmony. But harmony built on erasure isn't harmony. It's a quiet surrender. And I was done surrendering. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why they never noticed. While conversations about streamlining continued over Sunday lunches and forwarded emails, I began building something far less visible, a factual timeline. Dates, communications, drafts, versions. Not because I intended to attack anyone, but because memory shifts under pressure. And when families disagree, narratives bend. Documents don't. I started with the basics. Certified copies of the title register, historic conveyance abstracts, probate filings. I compared the language in my father's will to the proposed trust structure line by line. I flagged inconsistencies, not emotionally, but structurally. Clause 4.2 implied discretionary distribution. Original will, explicit joint vesting. Clause 7.1 trustee, authority to sell without unanimous beneficiary consent. Original ownership, co-owner signature required. Subtle changes, cleanly written, legally transformative. I met with the independent solicitor again, this time with a binder neatly tabbed. She reviewed everything in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, she looked up at me. "They cannot restructure ownership without your formal transfer or court authorization," she said. "If they attempt to proceed regardless, it becomes challengeable." Challengeable. I nodded. I wasn't seeking confrontation. I was seeking confirmation. Meanwhile, I visited the house less frequently, but with purpose. Each time I went, I observed quietly. I noticed which documents were left out. I noticed when new valuations were commissioned. I noticed that the locksmith's invoice had been paid from a joint account that technically still bore my legal name. They hadn't removed me administratively. They were assuming removal would follow naturally. The most telling moment came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I arrived to collect a box of my father's books. The front door didn't open. The new lock had been fully rekeyed. My old key turned uselessly. For a second, I stood there, hand on brass, listening to the faint hum of traffic behind me. They hadn't told me. I rang the bell. Daniel answered. "Oh," he said, as though mildly surprised. "We updated security. It's just easier this way. Mum has the keys." "Easier." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why I hadn't been informed. Instead, I smiled lightly. "That makes sense," I said. "Security's important." He stepped aside to let me in. That was the moment they miscalculated. Because changing locks without addressing ownership isn't symbolic. It's evidence. I didn't argue about access that day. I didn't request a key. I carried the box of books to my car and left. That evening, I documented the date and time of the lock change. I retained a copy of the locksmith's invoice, which I had photographed discreetly when it was left on the kitchen counter weeks earlier. Access restriction without co-owner consent. Not dramatic. Procedural. Over the next month, I reduced visible engagement, fewer lunches, shorter replies, no objections. And beneath that quiet surface, I prepared something else. I instructed my solicitor to draft a formal notice of ownership affirmation, citing the original deed, probate confirmation, and the absence of any executed transfer instrument bearing my signature. We did not send it immediately. Timing matters. Instead, we filed a protective restriction with the land registry, ensuring no disposition of the property could occur without my express written consent. They didn't know. From their perspective, nothing had changed. They still believed the trust paperwork would move forward. They still believed I would eventually sign out of fatigue, out of loyalty, out of habit. They underestimated something fundamental. I wasn't reacting to emotion. I was responding to the fact. And facts, when positioned correctly, do not require volume. They require patience. The locks had changed, but the title had not, and I intended to keep it that way. The discovery didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. It came with stillness. About 6 weeks after the locks were changed, my solicitor called me on a Thursday afternoon. Her tone was measured, professional, but there was something beneath it. A shift. "I've completed a deeper review of the historic filings," she said. "There's something you should see in person." I arrived at her office the next morning with my usual leather folio, the same one my father had once teased me about carrying like a barrister. It felt heavier that day, though nothing inside had changed. She laid out a sequence of documents across the conference table. Certified probate, official copy of title, original conveyance, supplemental deed from 1987. The 1987 deed was the one I hadn't fully appreciated before. It wasn't just a routine update. It was a survivorship clarification, executed when my grandfather's health had declined. It explicitly structured the property to pass outside discretionary manipulation, ensuring direct vesting to named successors under clear conditions. My father had been meticulous, and buried in the phrasing, precise, deliberate, was something neither Daniel nor my mother appeared to have recognized. The property did not merely transfer jointly upon my father's death. It transferred with a protective structure that limited unilateral restructuring during the lifetime of the surviving co-owner. In simple terms, neither of us could materially alter ownership without the other, not morally. Legally, the proposed trust conversion required my formal deed of transfer. Without it, any attempt to register a new ownership structure would fail or trigger a challenge. I sat back in the chair, no triumph, no smile, just clarity settling into place. They can't bypass you, my solicitor said calmly, not without your signature or a court order. And based on what I see, a court would not override this lightly. That was the moment I understood something fully. They had been operating on an assumption that I wouldn't read, assumption that I wouldn't question, assumption that quiet equals compliant. But quiet doesn't mean unaware. It means deliberate. I walked out of that office not with a sense of victory, but with alignment. The situation wasn't ambiguous anymore. It wasn't emotional. It was structural. That evening, I sat alone in my flat and placed the original title deed on the table in front of me. I traced the embossed seal lightly with my thumb. This document had existed longer than any current disagreement, longer than Daniel's confidence, longer than my mother's anxiety about simplifying. It wasn't about sentimentality. It was about continuity. And continuity, when documented properly, resists convenience. For the first time since my father's death, I allowed myself a single, honest acknowledgement. They had changed the locks. But I held the architecture, not because I fought for it, because I had quietly preserved it. There's a difference between discovering leverage and using it recklessly. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. I wasn't interested in public correction. I was interested in restoring balance, precisely, cleanly. Over the next week, I asked myself difficult questions. Do I confront them immediately? Do I send a formal notice now? Do I wait until they attempt registration? Each option had consequences, and one truth anchored all of them. Once I acted, there would be no returning to the version of me they were comfortable with. The dependable executor would be gone. In his place would stand someone they hadn't rehearsed for, and that realization didn't frighten me. It steadied me, because for the first time in this entire process, I wasn't reacting to exclusion. I was operating from ownership, quietly, completely. Once you understand your leverage, the real challenge isn't discovering it, it's deciding how to use it. For several days, I did nothing. I went to work. I attended meetings. I responded to routine emails. Outwardly, my life remained unchanged. But internally, I was weighing something irreversible. There were options. Option 1, confront them privately. Lay out the documents on the dining table and explain, calmly, that the proposed trust structure was impossible without my consent. Give them an opportunity to withdraw with dignity. Option 2, refuse to sign and let the paperwork stall quietly. No escalation, no formal action, simply inertia. Option 3, move preemptively. Secure legal affirmation of my co-ownership and prevent any further attempt to marginalize it, formally, publicly, if necessary. Each path carried a cost. Confrontation risked emotional fracture. Inertia risked manipulation through persistence. Preemptive action risked being labeled aggressive. I asked myself a question I hadn't considered before. If my father were alive, what would he advise? He wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't believe in unnecessary conflict. But he believed in clarity. Handle things properly the first time, he used to say. Cleanly. The memory of that phrase settled something in me. I realized that confronting them privately would still rely on persuasion. It would reopen the debate. It would invite reinterpretation of language that was already precise. And I was no longer interested in debate. This wasn't about convincing them I deserved inclusion. I was already included by law. The issue wasn't whether I had a seat at the table. The issue was that they had quietly tried to remove my name from the placard. And once someone attempts that, restoring balance requires more than conversation. It requires structure. I met my solicitor again the following Monday. I don't want conflict, I told her, but I do want finality. She nodded. Then you'll need formal affirmation of title and, if necessary, enforcement of access rights. Enforcement. The word wasn't aggressive, it was procedural. We drafted a formal notice asserting my co-ownership rights and objecting to any unilateral restructuring attempts. We prepared documentation to register an additional restriction on the property, ensuring no transfer, trust conversion, or refinancing could proceed without my explicit consent. And then I made the irreversible choice. I authorized her to prepare a court application, not to take the house from anyone, not to evict, but to formally affirm ownership and restore full access rights after the unauthorized lock change, not as retaliation, as a correction. Because once locks are changed without the co-owner's consent, it crosses from assumption into action, and actions require a response. When I signed the authorization form, I didn't feel anger. I felt still. There's a peculiar calm that comes from deciding you will no longer negotiate your existence in spaces you legally occupy. They believed I wouldn't push back. They believed the path of least resistance was permanent. They believed quiet meant pliable. They were about to learn something subtle. Silence can precede movement. And when movement comes, it doesn't have to be loud to be decisive. The weeks that followed were uneventful on the surface. That was intentional. Legal processes, when handled properly, don't announce themselves. They unfold in quiet filings, stamped forms, and scheduled hearings. No drama, no spectacle. While Sunday lunches continued, slightly thinner in attendance now, I was attending something else entirely: structured correction. My solicitor filed the application to formally affirm co-ownership rights and restore access. It wasn't a claim of aggression. It wasn't a demand for damages. It was a request for clarity. The court doesn't concern itself with family narratives. It concerns itself with documentation, and documentation was on my side. In parallel, the restriction we had placed on the land registry was acknowledged and recorded. Any attempt to alter the title, register a trust conversion, or refinance would now require my signature explicitly. They didn't know yet. From their perspective, I was simply distant. James has been busy, my mother told relatives. I later heard. He's processing things in his own way. She wasn't wrong. I was processing, just not emotionally. One evening, Daniel sent another polite reminder about the trust document. Appreciate your signature soon so we can move forward. I replied simply, I'm reviewing structural implications carefully. Will revert. No accusation, no explanation. Just delay. Strategic, measured. 2 weeks later, a formal letter arrived at the house, addressed jointly to both registered co-owners. Court notification. Application regarding co-ownership, affirmation, and access rights. Daniel called me that evening. His voice wasn't angry. It was confused. James, what is this? I answered evenly. It's clarification. There was a pause. You didn't need to escalate this, he said quietly. Escalate? The word floated between us. I didn't escalate, I replied. I formalized. He exhaled, frustrated but controlled. Mum is upset. I'm not trying to upset anyone, I said. I'm trying to align what exists on paper with how we're behaving. That was the first time the tone shifted, not into shouting, into discomfort. Because discomfort is what happens when assumptions meet structure. Over the following weeks, the emotional temperature around me cooled noticeably. Fewer casual texts, fewer invitations. Conversations became careful. Meanwhile, I attended the preliminary hearing with my solicitor. There were no dramatic speeches, no raised voices. The judge reviewed the filings, the will, the deed chain, and the evidence of unilateral lock replacement. The conclusion was procedural and calm. Co-ownership affirmed. Unilateral access restriction inappropriate. Full access will be restored. Costs minimal. It was not a victory speech. It was a correction. I left the courthouse carrying the certified order in a sealed envelope. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I drove home in silence, noticing how ordinary the afternoon looked. Traffic lights, pedestrians, a child crossing the street with a backpack too large for his shoulders. Life doesn't pause for personal shifts, but something had undeniably changed. They had changed the locks. I had changed ownership back into clarity, back into alignment, back into something documented and enforceable. And they still didn't fully understand what that meant. Not yet. Consequences rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as an absence. The first sign wasn't anger. It was hesitation. After the court order was delivered to the house, formally, respectfully, communication shifted. Daniel stopped sending reminder emails about the trust. My mother's messages became shorter, polite, careful. No one mentioned the hearing directly. Instead, there was a new tone, measured. I was no longer the dependable executor who would eventually comply. I was now a registered co-owner with a court-affirmed right of access. Structure changes perception. 1 week after the order, I returned to the house, not dramatically, not accompanied by anyone. I rang the bell. My mother opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The new lock was still there. "I'll need a key," I said gently. Not demanding, not confrontational, just factual. She hesitated, only slightly, then stepped aside. "I suppose so." The envelope containing the additional keys sat on the hallway table. She handed one to me without meeting my eyes. That small transfer of metal carried more weight than any argument could have. Inside the house, nothing had changed physically. The staircase still creaked in 3 places. The light still filtered through the same narrow window above the landing. But the atmosphere was different. Daniel arrived midway through my visit. He nodded at me. No hostility, just restraint. "We didn't think you'd go that far," he said quietly. "Neither did I replied. That was true. I hadn't wanted formal affirmation. I had wanted recognition, but recognition had required documentation. Over the following days, subtle losses began to surface for them. The refinancing discussion stalled entirely because lenders now required both co-owners' signatures. The trust conversion became irrelevant. Future streamlining required collaboration. The assumption of unilateral direction was gone. They hadn't lost the house. They had lost control. And control, once internalized, is difficult to relinquish gracefully. Relatives began calling my mother, not angrily, but cautiously. I wasn't present for those conversations, but I could sense their ripple effects. I wasn't painted as a villain, but I was no longer described as easygoing. I had stepped outside my assigned role, and that unsettled the ecosystem. One evening, my mother called me directly. "Why didn't you just talk to us?" she asked, her voice tired rather than accusatory. I paused before answering. "I tried," I said gently. "When I asked about survivorship clauses, when I asked about transfer implications, you thought I was being technical." Silence lingered. "We were trying to simplify things," she said. "I know," I replied. "But simplification shouldn't erase people." That was the closest we came to confrontation. No shouting, no blame, just 2 people recognizing that assumption had replaced communication. The consequences weren't dramatic. No one moved out. No one was forced to sell. But the dynamic had shifted permanently. They now had to consult me, not out of courtesy, out of necessity, and that subtle rebalancing carried its own gravity. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt proportionate. For the first time since my father's death, my presence in that house was not conditional. It was acknowledged. And acknowledgement changes everything. Regret rarely announces itself. It reveals itself in tone. A month after the court affirmation, my mother invited me to tea, not as part of a larger family gathering, but alone. That alone felt significant. When I arrived, the house was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not tense, just aware. She poured tea carefully, both hands steady but deliberate. "We didn't mean to push you out," she began. I believed her. Intent and impact rarely align perfectly in families. "That's the uncomfortable truth. You changed the locks," I said gently, not accusing, just stating a fact. She looked down. Daniel thought it would simplify things. With contractors coming and paperwork, he said it would be cleaner. Cleaner. That word again. "What did you think?" I asked. She hesitated longer this time. "I thought you wouldn't mind." There it was. Not malice, not a conspiracy, assumption. Because I had never minded before. Because I had always adapted. Because I had always absorbed. She continued, softer now. "We thought you didn't want the responsibility. You never fought for it." I nodded slowly. "That's true," I said. "I didn't fight. I maintained. Maintenance isn't loud. It doesn't draw applause. It doesn't demand recognition, but it sustains things. And once something sustained is threatened, the response isn't anger, it's correction." She exhaled. "Daniel feels blindsided." "I understand," I replied, "but being surprised isn't the same as being wronged." The distinction was settled between us. Over the following weeks, there were small attempts at repair. Daniel suggested we start fresh and revisit the trust idea collaboratively. My aunt proposed a mediated discussion to clear the air, but something fundamental had shifted, not in hostility, in perception. They now saw me as someone capable of formal action, capable of drawing lines. And once that image replaces the old one, you can't rewind it. There is a cost to stepping out of your assigned role. Even when you're right, the easy version of me, the endlessly accommodating one, was gone. In his place stood someone calm, measured, but immovable when necessary. And that version unsettled them, not because he was cruel, because he was no longer predictable. The irony is this: if they had simply included me from the beginning, if they had acknowledged co-ownership without attempting to restructure around me, none of this would have happened. No court, no formal notices, no recalibration. But once someone tries to quietly edit you out of your own story, restoring your name isn't optional. It becomes necessary. One afternoon, as I stood alone in my father's old study, I ran my hand along the bookshelf he'd built himself decades ago. Nothing in the house felt different physically, yet the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Trust, once strained by assumption, doesn't snap back into place. It stabilizes differently. They wanted to fix it now, to smooth it over. But some corrections aren't about smoothing, they're about boundaries. And boundaries, once drawn clearly, remain. The final conversation happened on a quiet Saturday morning. No audience, no raised voices, just the three of us. We're seated at the dining table where the first streamlining discussion had taken place months earlier. The sunlight fell across the wood in the same way. Dust drifts lazily in the air. It felt almost symmetrical. Daniel spoke first. "We need clarity going forward," he said. His tone was steady, less confident than before, but not defensive. "Are you planning to force a sale or block everything indefinitely?" There it was, the underlying fear. I folded my hands on the table. "I'm not forcing a sale," I said calmly, "and I'm not blocking anything indefinitely. I'm requiring collaboration." My mother looked between us, quieter than usual. We were trying to make decisions efficiently, she said. Things felt uncertain after your father passed. I understand, I replied. But efficiency isn't ownership, and uncertainty doesn't justify exclusion. Daniel leaned back slightly. You could have just told us you wouldn't sign. I did, I said gently. When I asked about structural implications, when I asked about survivorship language, you assumed those were technicalities. He didn't respond immediately, because he knew it was true. I wasn't there to win an argument. I wasn't there to lecture them about legal nuance. I was there to establish something simple. I was not removable. I don't want control, I continued. I want recognition of what already exists. We're co-owners. That means decisions require both of us. The room felt still. No tension humming. No sharp edges. Just recalibration. Daniel exhaled slowly. I misjudged you, he said at last. Not dramatically. Not apologetically. Just honestly. Yes, I said. There was no need to soften it. He nodded once. I thought you wouldn't push back. I didn't want to, I replied. But that's not the same as being unable to. That distinction seemed to land more heavily than anything else. My mother reached for her tea, hands steady now. So, what happens next? She asked. We move forward properly, I said. If we discuss restructuring, we do it transparently. If we refinance, we agree together. If we sell one day, it's mutual. No ultimatums, no threats, just structure. The confrontation wasn't explosive. It was clarifying. For the first time, they weren't speaking to the version of me they had assumed would adapt endlessly. They were speaking to someone measured, informed, and immovable when necessary. And the remarkable thing was, I didn't feel anger toward them. I felt settled, because the goal had never been domination. It had been balanced. They changed the locks. I changed ownership back. Not to punish, to restore. And sitting there at that table, with no raised voices and no lingering accusations, I realized something quietly powerful. Dominance doesn't require volume. It requires certainty. I still visit the house regularly. The key rests on my keyring beside my flat key. No longer symbolic, just functional. The lock hasn't changed again. It doesn't need to. What's changed is quieter than hardware. It's posture. For most of my life, I confused restraint with virtue. I believed that absorbing discomfort made me stronger, that being the stable one meant stepping back so others could step forward. There's dignity in stability, but there's also danger in disappearing. I don't see myself as someone who won. There was no trophy, no dramatic reveal, no applause. If anything, the outcome was administrative, a correction in registry entries and expectations. But internally, something redefined itself. I no longer measure harmony by how much I'm willing to concede. I measure it by whether I am fully present within it. Daniel consults me now, not performatively, but directly. When financial topics arise, he asks instead of assuming. It's subtle, but unmistakable. The ecosystem adjusted. My mother and I speak more honestly than we did before. Not constantly, not emotionally, just clearly. She once said to me, months after everything settled, I didn't realize you felt sidelined. I didn't realize I was allowing it, I replied. That's the part that matters most. This wasn't just about locks or deeds or legal filings. It was about the role I had quietly accepted for years. Reliable, useful, invisible. I'm still reliable. I'm still practical, but I'm no longer invisible. And the remarkable thing is, I didn't have to become louder to achieve that. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't tear the family apart. I used documentation, structure, lawful correction. There's a form of quiet dominance that doesn't seek attention. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't dramatize. It simply refuses erasure. When I walk through the hallway now, I don't feel triumphant. I feel aligned. The staircase creaks in the same three places. The afternoon light still lands across the landing window. Nothing physical changed, but I did. I understand now that peace without self-respect isn't peace. It's postponement. And boundaries don't have to be loud to be unbreakable. They just have to be clear. I am still the steady one. But steadiness, I've learned, isn't about yielding. It's about standing. If you had asked me a year ago who I was, I would have said something simple, dependable, calm, easygoing. I still am those things. But now, there's an addition I don't apologize for. Defined. This story was never about revenge. It wasn't about humiliating anyone or winning a house. It was about something quieter and far more universal. What happens when the person everyone relies on decides they will no longer be quietly rearranged? They changed the locks. I changed ownership back. Not to dominate, not to punish, but to correct. There's a powerful misconception about quiet people that we lack thresholds. That because we don't react quickly, we won't react at all. That patience equals passivity. It doesn't. Patience is observation, and observation, when paired with clarity, becomes leverage. The turning point in my story wasn't the court order. It wasn't the restored key. It wasn't even the legal affirmation. It was the moment I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and started asking whether I was allowing myself to disappear. If you are the reliable one in your family, the steady one, the one who fixes things without being asked, you may recognize the pattern. You may have heard, "You don't mind. You're flexible. You'll be fine." Sometimes those words are compliments. Sometimes they're assumptions. And assumptions, left unchallenged, harden into decisions made without you. The lesson I learned is simple. Boundaries don't require volume. They require clarity and the willingness to formalize that clarity when necessary. You don't have to shout. You don't have to threaten. You just have to know what is yours and be prepared to stand behind it. So, I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been quietly written out of something important? But because people assumed you wouldn't object. And if so, at what point does silence stop being peace and start being permission? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments.